So I want to talk a little bit about sort of the sustainability of the model related to community design centers. And so Melvin, you mentioned you had two MJQ, right? So sort of wanted to, in that context, or in the context of Arch, or in the context of sort of your knowledge of other efforts that have sort of followed that sort of community design center path, what do we think about, is the model sustainable, right? You can think about factors such as location, politics, economics, but what are some of the challenges, opportunities? What do we think about this sort of model as a whole?
Well, sometimes we have to go back a little further and a little deeper into history to understand that a lot of what we're talking about today, there are many precedents, and they didn't just start because we. In this particular case, again, I want to make your point. I want to go back to Bond himself. Got to go a little deeper behind the man. Bryant Goldstein, of course, has done the definitive book on not just Harlem and Arch, and of course a lot more is going to come out. A lot more is going to come out on Max. But the thing about Max is that his precedent was again Howard University and Hilliard Robinson back in the 1930, 1940s, when he was setting up the architecture school at Howard. And at that time that he was doing that, his office was just a short walk away from the campus. It was on U Street, and his office functioned really as a teaching office for architects, for black architects, in the same sense that I found that it was existing at Harvard in terms of the whole Gropius situation. But it's very important that we understand so much of what was already happening and this relationship between Bond and Arch and the Arch model and the precedents that had gone on at Howard University. Incidentally, quick story. In 1972, Max actually threw his hat in the ring to become the dean of the School of Architecture at Howard. So he for all sorts of obvious reasons, he knew and understood the historic Black College connections. The parents, and so all of those things were there. So I'm saying all this and trying to say that none of this is new. We've got to know and understand our history, and we've got to know to the extent that Max was coming from a position of history and understanding history and what the real important precedents were, all the way back. The young gentleman did a student presentation. It was a wonderful presentation, but he said something to the effect that when the Harlem Renaissance was started, and he talked about the boys and all that. The fact of the matter is, the Harlem Renaissance was quarterbacked from Howard University's campus by Elaine Locke, a Howard University professor. Literally was quarterbacked from the campus, commuting. So these ties and these precedents are very, very, very strong. And I don't think, in the short run right now, a lot of things are going on that can be very discouraging. But in the long run, I think the Arch model and how it is a precedent for, I see really, it was a community design center, but that community design center idea is really the Community Development Corporation Center, and what it's doing. And I think was, I don't think that that's going to be stopped. At least I hope it does, and I hope that that's accelerated. But it's all rounded in Max and Arch, and Max was well rounded in historically black college and university experience.
I am so glad you brought that up, and I'm going to go slightly off record, but I had an opportunity to visit Tuskegee University this summer, and what I didn't know was, I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because you probably know better than me, but Max's dad was at Tuskegee, and that means that Max Bond as a child was walking that campus. And if you don't know the history of Tuskegee University, it's very fascinating, but the students built the campus.
And they created black architects.
That's right.
Yes, so it's a really interesting, yeah, you're right, it's Arch, but there's predecessors before that. The importance of the HBCUs and a lot of what was happening at the time out of necessity, right? They needed to build the campus, right? They didn't have other people to build the campus, so they did it out of necessity, but it also allowed them to gain skills along the way that made them more, it provided a career path. So I think that there's definitely lessons to be learned from that model that we're picking up on today.
And if I could add, the necessity to build the campus, sometimes not exactly. The head of Tuskegee was actually, when the big important white philanthropists were throwing money at him, they always also wanted to give their favorite white architect, and he resisted. He said, no, we've got some ideas about that.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. So thank you for tying that together. I'm gonna shift over because I'm realizing, wow, that one took a lot of time. I guess the next question I have is sort of a tricky one. It's about language and how we define community. And so, given the diverse interpretations of community, how do you think organizations effectively can engage and organize communities that may not yet see themselves as sort of cohesive? And maybe if you can share examples from Arch, or maybe other direct actions that you may be familiar with in your own practice. What Robert like to?
So I also want to answer the sustainability question, but maybe I'll pause. I think it's evocative and symbolic that essentially Arch's first action under Hatch was to organize one of the first Head Start preschools in the country, which was on 116th Street and now Frederick Douglass Boulevard in West Harlem. And that helped give rise to the West Harlem Community Organization, which is a very important entity in the work they did in West Harlem. I think it's also, on that subject, it's important not to forget that this organization would not have been possible without the grassroots action of a number of black women who were deeply engaged in community organizing in their neighborhoods. Margaret McNeil was the force in West Harlem that they worked closely with. Alice Cornegay in East Harlem Triangle, who is just an amazing person who was, without Alice Cornegay, Arch would not have succeeded in any of their work there. Arch in this way comes out of the community organizing tradition that is developing in the years right before it in the South, in work of people like Fannie Lou Hamer, Septima Clark, in Mississippi around voting. The idea that you would organize an architecture effort in a preschool may seem slightly odd, but of course that's the ground in which you bring people together, they meet each other, they talk about their common concerns. Also, I think, as Hatch's image reminds us that Arch was a multiracial political coalition. That's something that becomes more complicated and problematic by the late 60s, and Arch, I think, navigates Black Power pretty well. But it's the fact that you have a number of different people who found inspiration in the model, who come to it, and then out of it, certainly in 2MJQ is one example, but the Newark Area Planning Association in Newark, there's I used to teach at the University of New Mexico. The Community Design Center there starts in 1969, and that's largely kind of working in self-described Hispanic communities in Albuquerque. These are all groups that come out of Arch directly and indirectly because they see themselves in it, and it's the idea that, of course, blackness is essential to Arch's self-definition by the late 60s, but it's not there at the beginning. It's really about a kind of idea of a multiracial political coalition. And let's not forget, Max Bond is Max Bond, but Max Bond is the director of Arch starting in '67 because he went to Harvard with Richard Hatch and Jack Bailey, who were and Ken Simmons. So they come out of an elite world of very, very skillful young architects, and it's the fact that they know each other that makes that social network possible. In terms of sustainability, I won't go on, but I'll just ask one question, which I think is worth asking, is, was Arch ever sustainable? I'm not so sure that it was. I think, it lasted for 10 years. The last few years were not good years, and Richard Hatch told me, it effectively started because Stephen Currier, who died soon after in a plane crash, but was from a very affluent family and ran something called the Taconic Foundation, basically opened a drawer and handed him a bunch of cash. So, that maybe is a reminder that these groups, sustainability may not be the way we can measure them, but of course that doesn't mean that they weren't really important for a long time.
The sustainability question is something that I think reserves a lot of attention, but going back to the issue of defining community or bringing community together, that is something that is challenging. It can be problematic. You can hear in public discussions comments about what the community wants or the community needs, but as you dig into some of the conversations, you will often find that community can be a bit balkanized. There are different voices, different groups that on the surface may say they agree. When you get into the actual details, there are real differences. In some cases, those differences are driven by misunderstandings. I know that at Community Board 12, through the various committees, there are lots of efforts made to point out common issues, common problems that folks may think that they have, but their neighbors don't, or folks who live in this part of the community have the problem, but folks that live in that part of the community don't understand. And in many cases, that is not the case, but it is an initial task to cut through some of that balkanization. And in other cases, the balkanization is real. You can have, in Manhattan, just because you have a geographic district and you say this is Community Board X, it doesn't mean that you have people who share common interest. And in some cases, depending upon who is controlling that community board and who is the voice of that community board, they may in fact be ignoring the interests or concerns of their neighbors. So community is a challenging concept. It sounds great, and it should be something that's good, but I will tell you that listening to some of the side conversations, because folks will get up and they'll say the wonderful things, or why they want something to happen or not happen. When you hear some of the side comments, it's interesting for someone to say that I never see that person in my part of the community, or you're only saying that's good because it's over there, but if we were to put it in your neighborhood or your part, you wouldn't support that. And I've lived in the community for X number of decades, but I've never been 2 blocks over to where that project is. So folks can be very balkanized in what they consider to be community, and community board becomes a much larger thing, or even neighborhood becomes a much larger thing, because folks may look at their block or a couple of blocks as being what they consider community, and they don't have a broader interest in what's going on elsewhere. And it's in many cases important to point out that what is impacting someone over there has an impact on you. If not immediately, the way a policy is written or the way a law is implemented means it can have a future impact on you. And community needs to be more mindful of the broader whole and not just sort of myopic interest.
Yeah, on the sustainability issue, Arch as a community design center was certainly not sustainable. But what evolved from the community design center, which I call, for lack of something better or more elegant, the Community Development Corporation or the Community Development Center, is not only sustainable, but it's the way, it's the direction. So we have to remember, Max was both an educator and he was an entrepreneur practitioner, and so he was bent on bending architecture to the needs of his people. Max was an integrationist, but he was a black integrationist. That didn't mean he was a separatist in terms of the black and white issues, nothing remotely to that effect. But he was about integrating with the poor and the downtrodden and the afflicted with his class of elites, if you want to think about them that way, but simply people who educated and who had skills. He was about that integration, and so that's kind of how I see and think of the sustainability issue.
And it's interesting to think about community development corporations as being, the children, so to speak, of Arch, because if you look at, an organization like the Community League of the Heights, which has been around, I think, for 72 years, it started out with a smaller mission, but if you look at cloth today, whatever the community needs, it sets out to do. So if you need a food pantry, if you need a school, if you need housing. So it's really looking at, at a very grassroots level, what does the community need? And not find someone else to do it, but to find the resources so you can deliver that. It's not the same, approach as having the architects as directly involved, and I think that's something we need to look at how, the Bond Center and others can, continue to cultivate a pipeline of, practitioners of color who see architecture and planning, as a career goal. I sort of fell into it. Believe it or not, in junior high school, we had mechanical drafting, and then I went to the High School of Art and Design, where the first year you took every major the school offered, one of which was architecture, and then for the next 2 years, you majored in something like you were in college. So I did architecture in high school, and then went on to do it in college. But if community development corporations had sort of an education component that plugged into schools and raised the visibility of architecture and planning, as an option for folks, I think that would be a good addition to what they do. But to some extent, it is interesting to look at community development corporations as the children of Arch and of community design centers.
From the standpoint of someone who who wasn't really around at that time, what I understood about the design centers and how they worked, basically when I see what was available when I started practicing, I thought that based on the description that HUDC was very close.
I never worked with
I thought that was like because that organization, although it was like a government thing, it still had the spirit of what I imagined the design centers that we're talking about today had, and that you could feel that you were doing something for a community, that the people's voices were heard. Usually before you got the project, but sometimes after you got the project. And I think that was one of the creations that I thought, if it didn't come from our earlier model, it certainly must have been based on it in terms of, number one, identifying problems in a community. And I worked on many of those projects that were projects that no one else would have touched if it had not been for HUDC. And so I think that there are other different ways of reshaping how that comes about. And I also worked on the community planning group, and I was in the housing and the development section for Community Board 10, and what I realized there was that sometimes it depended on the strength of the people who took over, like, what was her name? Noreen Clark Smith, for those of you who were that old, was a person, who was a self-made leader, who ran the Community Board 10, as if it had a purpose, and she wasn't going to let it get away. And the purpose was to serve people, to serve the community. And I think that when you think that it's possible, because not all community boards work the same way, but when it is possible to do that, there are community boards who make those changes and who stand up for the community in that way, and that's important too. And I also saw Abyssinia Development Corporation as an important entity in terms of how do you replace something that used to be something else. But it was good in that it also developed projects that related to the community and represented the community to the degree that I think was necessary.
Yeah. So I think Roberta made an interesting point about Harlem Urban Development Corporation, which is different from Harlem Community Development Corporation. And, HUDC, which I never worked for, although I did send them my resume. But they had development, they had basically an in-house architecture department, they had real estate, property management, and, students from City College, many of them had an opportunity to get jobs there. But you also had a friendly or friendlier state government, HUDC being a state entity, part of the Urban Development Corporation, and the idea that you needed a Harlem-based organization to deal with development issues in Harlem was something, I guess, that was part of the context of the time. But if you have a change at the state level that takes HUDC and dissolves it and reduces it to an agency that is maybe a third the size, which is Harlem Community Development Corporation, which I worked for, we still had the people in Harlem, and I remember a few of the people who worked at HUDC, who still worked at Harlem CDC, that the folks downtown in the parent corporation don't really understand what it is we're trying to do uptown. But that goes to the issue of sustainability. If someone has the ability to pull the rug out from under you, it can and does weaken your ability to advance your agenda. However, as Roberta said, if you have people who are committed to the agenda, you will take the lemons and try to make lemonade out of it.
Just to make the link clear, HUDC is a direct outgrowth of the state office building protests, which we'll, I'm sure, talk about in our third panel. I also think it's one of many parables, as is Abyssinian Development Corporation, as is Arch itself, about the difficult road these kinds of organizations follow, and also the inability to define a monolithic community. At HUDC's inception, there was a much more radical vision of Harlem that was on the table, and kind of, even though folks like Alice Cornegay were involved in HUDC, the kind of ministers and that entity of Harlem become kind of the largest force behind HUDC, and it diverges at that point. It's not to say that it's not impactful, because it was, but it takes a very different approach to Harlem's development as a result of that. There's a much more commercial in orientation than what Arch was arguing for. So, I think Harlem Commonwealth Council, there's a lot of H blank blank blanks. Yeah, HCC has a somewhat similar path, and I think some of that is, people's personalities and the frailties of a human being, but a lot of it is also the reality of working in a capitalist system in which you do need to do something that makes income, or you cease to exist. And certainly by Arch's end, it's becoming more like an architecture firm. And I think anyone here with any kind of foot in the world of community design centers knows well the sort of tension between, do I keep applying for grants and get nothing done, or do I become a fee-for-service organization and essentially become just a firm? And it's really hard to walk that line in a way that isn't going to somewhat determine what you do. I think at the moment we have organizations like Melvin who have somewhat taken the mantle of groups like Ford Foundation in Arch's day, but they change their priorities, and then what happens next? And certainly Arch was forced to navigate those, as all of these groups have been.
I'm going to fold the last question into sort of a final remarks if you have any last thing to say, right? So one, and I think we have actually touched on this, so feel free to spin your response however you'd like. But given the recent resurgence of interest in community designs, we're talking about it a lot more, and the challenges faced by well-known centers. We sort of heard a little bit about the closing of Hester Street, and there's others. What do you think success in community design looks like? Maybe here in Harlem, communities of color, other neighborhoods you might be familiar with. And then sort of what your final thoughts might be on what just urban futures look like within community design, and how do we ensure that these designs promote equity and inclusivity in our communities moving forward?
It's a tough question to answer in a sense, because looking at just futures, to me, it is having the ability to truly engage with community stakeholders to discuss in depth the issue or issues that you want to advance, and to shape a policy approach for how you want it to advance. The problem then is ensuring that it is implemented. And if you don't know, community boards are advisory. So, for example, if we are charged by both the Department of City Planning and the Economic Development Corporation to do a deep dive into the Inwood rezoning and to give detailed responses to how we would not only like to see the rezoning shaped, but also other economic investments that would go along with that, and you put together the equivalent of a 12-page policy paper, which is the resolution that is passed by the community board and one of the land use staff at the city council. It's one of the best resolutions they've ever seen dealing with the issue, that then doesn't get implemented. So the resolution/policy paper may outline a vision for a just future, but it's in someone else's hands to take that recommendation and make it real.